In 1943, on the battered Italian peninsula, Allied armies advanced through mountains and ruined towns. Their enemy lay ahead. But sometimes, the greatest danger came from behind. This is the story of when the Allies erased their OWN in 1943. The war in Italy was meant to be a push toward liberation and a step closer to the heart of Axis power. The Allies had landed in Sicily that summer, then crossed the Strait of Messina, and continued north. Italy was no longer simply an enemy nation. Its government had collapsed. Its loyalties had fractured. The Germans now defended the peninsula with grim determination. Towns became fortresses. Valleys became traps. Communication was fragile. Weather, terrain, and exhaustion shaped every day. The Allied armies were a patchwork of nationalities and units. British, American, Canadian, Indian, New Zealand, Polish, and other forces operated side by side. Radios were imperfect. Maps were inconsistent. Command structures overlapped. Much depended on quick judgments, and sometimes those judgments were made with incomplete information. Air power was central to Allied plans. Bombers and fighter bombers struck rail lines, troop positions, bridges, and convoys. Pilots often flew through cloud, fog, or smoke. Ground troops marked their positions as best they could. But the front line shifted constantly. What was safe airspace in the morning could become a battlefield by afternoon. In southern and central Italy, this fragile coordination was repeatedly tested. Some units pushed ahead faster than expected. Others were delayed by ambushes, mines, or destroyed roads. Reports arrived late. Orders crossed in transmission. Yet the pressure never eased. Commanders demanded momentum. Air crews demanded targets. The rhythm of attack became relentless. Into this rhythm came tragic uncertainty. Sometimes, Allied aircraft misidentified friendly columns. Sometimes, artillery coordinates were misunderstood. In other cases, advancing infantry entered zones already marked for bombardment. These were not isolated events. They formed a shadow narrative within the campaign. Soldiers marching along dusty roads learned to fear the sound of their own aircraft approaching overhead. Vehicles carried makeshift recognition symbols. Infantry waved panels or signal cloths. Yet confusion remained possible, especially when combat compressed men and machines into chaotic spaces. In official reports, many of these incidents appeared only as brief lines. Losses due to misdirected fire. Aircraft engaged friendly column in error. The language was neutral. Detached. Precise. It avoided names. It avoided grief. But the human reality was different. On the ground, the aftermath was silent and stunned. Survivors carried forward, because the war did not pause. This pattern, repeated across 1943 Italy, shaped morale and memory. It exposed the limits of coordination in an age of expanding technology. It revealed how war blurred recognition and identity. And in many cases, it led to an uncomfortable silence. Friendly fire remained a subject more easily forgotten than examined. In the shadows of larger victories, these stories faded. As the Allied advance continued through Italy in 1943, the land itself resisted each movement. The Apennine Mountains cut across the peninsula like a barrier. Roads twisted up steep slopes and vanished into ravines. Units dispersed for cover. Columns stretched into long, vulnerable lines. From the air, these lines resembled enemy formations. Dust clouds made identification harder. At altitude, the details of uniform or marking dissolved into shapes. Pilots flew under pressure to strike quickly and withdraw. They relied on intelligence briefings, target maps, and last-minute radio updates. But weather changed. Ground units maneuvered unexpectedly. German units sometimes drove captured vehicles or moved along the same roads. The boundary between friend and foe narrowed to seconds of recognition. On the ground, soldiers heard the engines first. Some felt relief, assuming the aircraft were there to protect them. Others froze, aware that misidentification was possible. When the first bombs fell, shock replaced assumption. Trucks exploded. Convoys shattered. Infantry scattered into ditches and behind stone walls. Commanders tried to signal. Flares rose into the air. But the damage was often done in the opening minutes. Reports traveled slowly up the chain of command. Investigations followed. Some pilots never knew what had happened. Others realized only later, when briefed after landing. There was regret, but also a rigid wartime discipline. The mission tempo continued. Airfields remained busy. Squadrons rotated. Names of the dead rarely reached the aircrews who had caused their deaths. Among ground units, the impact was heavier. Trust in overhead support weakened. Men looked up with suspicion. They painted larger symbols on vehicles. They laid out recognition panels. Still, confidence could not fully return, because certainty never existed. Commanders attempted procedural fixes. Better marking systems. Improved communication protocols. Revised target briefs. But the war moved faster than the solutions. Each day produced fresh uncertainties. And the complexity of multinational cooperation ensured that clarity was never absolute. The Italian civilians living nearby saw only the aftermath. Wrecked vehicles. Burned equipment. Bodies hurriedly buried. They did not always know that these dead had fallen to their own side. In many villages, the details were never recorded. Over time, these incidents blended into the background of the campaign. They were acknowledged, but not emphasized. Official histories spoke of the bravery of the advance, the difficulty of the terrain, and the stubbornness of the German defense. The accidental losses were described as inevitable. Tragic. Unavoidable. Then the narrative moved on. Yet for those who had been there, the memories lingered. Soldiers remembered the sound of descending aircraft. The confusion. The disbelief. The silence afterward. They carried those memories beyond Italy, into later battles, and then into civilian life. But few spoke of them publicly. The war had many stories. This one was rarely told. The climax of this hidden history came during several concentrated actions in 1943, when Allied ground units advancing through Italian valleys and hill towns were struck by their own supporting forces in rapid succession. These were not isolated accidents, but moments when coordination collapsed under the strain of terrain, timing, and urgency. In one such case, an Allied column was moving north along a narrow road bordered by stone terraces and vineyards. The soldiers believed they were still behind the forward line. They expected air support to be directed ahead of them, toward German positions dug into the hills. The sky was clear. The formation spread along the road in routine order. There was no warning. High above, pilots received updated target coordinates. The area below was described as containing enemy movement. They descended through sunlight and haze, scanning for shapes on the ground. From their vantage point, the column matched the description of German transport. No hostile anti-aircraft fire appeared. The decision was made in seconds. The first bombs fell among the leading vehicles. Flames and smoke erupted. Men threw themselves to the ground. Radio operators tried to call for cancellation, But lines were unstable. Signals crews scrambled to lay out recognition panels. More aircraft passed overhead. Machine gun bursts struck the roadside. Those attempting rescue found themselves under fire as well. When the attack ended, the valley fell into uneasy quiet. Survivors searched for wounded among ruined trucks and shattered equipment. Medical units worked quickly, improvising where supplies had burned. Commanders assembled reports. Some names were never formally recorded, their identities lost in wartime chaos. What intensified the tragedy was its repetition. Days later, in another sector, a similar misidentification occurred. And again. The pattern revealed a systemic fragility in combined operations. But wartime necessity discouraged open debate. Leaders emphasized continuing the mission. Public acknowledgement was limited. The losses affected morale in subtle yet lasting ways. Soldiers became wary not only of the enemy but of the very systems meant to protect them. They understood that technology and coordination, however advanced, could fail under stress. They also understood that their stories might never become part of the celebrated narrative of victory. In post-war accounts, the Italian campaign was often summarized in broad strokes. The complexity of mountain warfare. The slow advance. The sacrifice. Within those summaries, the friendly fire tragedies remained compressed into a few words. For families who received sparse notifications, the circumstances of death were frequently unclear. Some never learned the truth. Thus the climax of this story is not a single explosion or moment of drama. It is the realization that entire groups of soldiers were lost through mistakes that were quietly absorbed into the wider machinery of war. Their absence became a blank space in the historical record. A silence that persisted long after the fighting ended. The war moved north. The front lines shifted. Towns changed hands. The valleys emptied. Soldiers who once filled the roads were gone. Only the broken ground remembered them. Burned trucks were dragged away. Wrecked metal was gathered and reused. The marks on the road slowly faded. Grass grew again over the disturbed earth. Fields returned to work. Villagers passed by without stopping. Life continued, but quietly. Reports were completed. Files were stored. The language was careful. Detached. Losses were counted as numbers. The names were reduced to lists. Many details were removed. Many questions were left unanswered. The archives closed around the truth. Families received brief notices. A death. A date. A location. Often nothing more. Some suspected what had happened. Others never guessed. Letters went unanswered. Records stayed silent. Years passed. The silence deepened. The soldiers who survived remembered. They remembered the sound of engines. The shock. The confusion. The stillness that followed. They carried these memories into the rest of their lives. But few spoke openly. It was easier to let the story fade. The Italian landscape forgot as well. Roads were repaired. Villages rebuilt. New generations grew up without knowing what had taken place there. The past became distant. Then it disappeared. No monument stands for these men. No ceremony recalls them. Their story lies between official lines. It exists only in fragments. In faint testimonies. In overlooked files. Those who died to friendly fire were lost twice. First in the attack. Then in memory. They slipped into the quiet space history does not often visit. And the hills of Italy remain still. If this story mattered to you, consider subscribing. More forgotten history is coming.